with respect to trade deficit with China, which has now touched $71.56 billion in the first 10 months of financial year 22 and 23. In the previous financial year, remember, the deficit was about 73.31 billion. Do note that these numbers are for the full financial year, so we don't know the entire picture, but we know that it's currently at about 71.56 for the first 10 months. Now, this according to data shared by Commerce Ministry in Lok Sabha in response to a query on trade deficit with China, which many believe that has been increasing, but the Minister of State and Commerce, Anupriya Patel, said that the trade deficit with China has in fact decreased progressively every year from 2017-18 to 20 and 21. However, remember, it increased in 21-22 compared to 22-21. She added, there is, an anomaly on whether our relationship with China and the trade deficit have got to a role to play with one another, Rakesh. But, an important question there, has the trade deficit been decreasing? Because that is the popular demand, but that necessarily does not augur well for the economy.
Well, I think, there are two ways of looking at it. We have a problem with China, which is well stated. But I have always maintained, I don't know, rightly or wrongly, and many supporters of that view, that we should delink the border dispute, which is the political dispute, and the economic challenges. The latest IMF report says that India and China, going forward in the financial year beginning April, two of them will be 50% drivers of the global economy, because global economy in the rest of the world is all facing possibly recessionary trends or is in a stagnated manner. So if India and China are going to drive global economy, there is a logical reason for us to work together in the economic framework. I am not too optimistic, like one school of thought that, in Chindia, which coined the term Chindia under Mr. Jairam Ramesh, who was, a senior minister in the UPA environment. But I think there's a lot of merit in examining having economic relationship with China independent of the political relationship. It's a difficult task, but we'll have to navigate that. See, India and China have both the external pressures from US and the West use India and China as countervailing pressure against each other. But there is great room to reimagine or at least explore what we used to call the Asian century. In that context, rising deficit, year on year or falling deficit should not worry us too much. What we must look at, that despite the border dispute, India has sustained its imports from China. When we talk about rising exports, like Srinath said, pharma, the APIs are coming from China, chips are coming from China. So how can you build India as the manufacturing base of the world without those imports coming from China? At least in the short to medium term, to my mind, we can't wish that away. So if we can't wish that away, why don't we coexist and explore relationships where we've done the symbolic banning of TikTok and few other Chinese companies in India. But when it comes to trade, we'll have to do the relationship as it exists today, because we need each other.
Okay. Srinath, border dispute is different from economic imperative. That is what Rakesh is saying. For most of the goods imported from China are capital goods, intermediate goods, raw materials that are necessary for meeting demands of a fast expanding economy like India. Actually,
Shweta, just before Srinath comes in, I'll just, I had an opportunity to meet Shyam Saran the day before yesterday, at a summit. And Shyam Saran, as we know all, was, foreign secretary and principal. He was a national security advisor to Manmohan Singh for a long period of time and worked very closely with the Chinese establishment in improving relationships. I think there is consensus today in this country, even with a UPA nominee like Shyam Saran, a bright foreign policy mind, that we have to look at China and not shut our eyes. We have to pursue the border dispute to our satisfaction, but keep the economic interests and economic relationships intact. So that is the level of endorsement coming from that bright mind. Srinath, please go ahead.
So I think I agree with Rakesh here. I mean, politically we might have all the differences. Ideologically, I mean, it probably makes for good print cover and television sound bites. But the fact is, economically, we are dependent in a lot of ways, interconnected with countries like China. I mean, API, classic example, semiconductors, raw materials for our manufacturing. I mean, China has a very, very dominant role in global manufacturing. I mean, what they did to the US, right? I mean, the US over the last 25, 30 years has been completely dependent on China for, I mean, right from probably toilet rolls to semiconductors. And I hope that India doesn't get to that state. But our PLI and manufacturing impetus, while the policies are great, it is not really transformed into those large manufacturing bases coming and setting up shop in India. We thought COVID, we would see regional supply chains emerge, and India could be a destination for a lot of those players out of China, and that has not happened as well. And mind you, this is despite the fact that China, people have concerns about intellectual property rights, about foreigners' rights. But one thing they've done it well over the last 30 years, the predominant role of SMEs and MSMEs in their large GDP. That's something a lesson for India. We've completely missed the boat. I mean, once in a while, we will have great grandiose sounding announcements that we have turned the needle for MSME and SME. But yet, guess what? I mean, there are over 7.5 to 10 lakh crores of MSME payments that are predominantly from the government entities. That's always overdue. So things like this, we'll have to turn the needle. How do we build a robust SME and MSME over the years? It won't happen overnight. Credit access is still a challenge. Two, manufacturing, a large global manufacturing base does not exist in India. I mean, look at the passenger car sales, for example. It is 10 to 18x of comparative brands. If you take, let's say, a Hyundai or a Kia or a Mercedes or a Volkswagen, that's the amount of level of consumption that China does, and the manufacturing as well. We don't do that yet. So short term, we might take pride saying we have turned the needle, things that people are interested in talking to India. But on the ground, if you look comparative manufacturing prowess, we will have to prove ourselves along the way.
Okay. Let me play out some numbers here just to put this into perspective, because it also often snowballs into a political affair. The trade deficit with China in 2004 and 5 was approximately $1.48 billion, increased to $36 billion in 13-14, which is approximately 2,346% rise. Against this massive increase, the trade deficit with China has since increased by about 102%, which is currently pegged at $73.31 billion dollars in 21-22 from $36 billion in 13 and 14, the financial year 2013 and 14. So essentially an argument there from the ruling government that, look, we've done enough, we've kept the imports at bay, and we are doing what we can, and it will take time, Rakesh, for India to build its own manufacturing capacities.
Absolutely. I mean, as I said, for a moment, we need a considered and a concerted policy vis-a-vis dealing with China on the economic matters. These numbers either way should not come as a stumbling block. Government of India, along with other relevant stakeholders, has to start telling and messaging the rest of the ecosystem that we cannot shut our eyes in regard to relationship with China when it comes to economy. I mean, we simply can't switch them off, as I said, and I repeat. It makes sense to see where we collaborate. I talked about the Asian century. I talked about how the world is looking at India and China. Of course, we compete. Of course, we must compete on every project. We're looking at Foxconn coming to India. We have iPhone phones, being manufactured in India, again with some raw material inputs coming from China. But hopefully soon, a completely 100% India-built product going abroad. And we have that example in Maruti. One of the key exporters from India. It's all India-built capability, but it's taken so many years to build that capability. Let's remember that, the push in this country all these years has not been towards building a large manufacturing base. It is now, in the last few years post-liberalization, that we've done it in bouts of massive pushes. Okay. And now the PLI scheme is a good example. Again, it has its own shortcomings because it's not all-inclusive as of now. And I agree with Srinath that when you have to do catching up with China, we have to perk up in a very big way the SME economy, because that's where they did well. Okay. I do believe that we made some mistakes in the beginning. For instance, when we opened up the automobile sector post-liberalization, China, by and large, just before that had opened up its own economy to global players. But what they did is that they said, if you want to invest in India, you will have to invest in the SMEs with Chinese companies. We did that in a limited way, not as the same way that China did. So China encouraged right away, the process of building its small enterprises and then scaling them up as the economy grew.
Okay. Srinath, for the benefit of our viewers, what are the broad categories in which there is a large gap between domestic supply and demand?
So definitely on APIs, API formulations, there's a huge demand. Electronics, again, huge demand. Raw materials for most of our consumer electronics and comes from China. If we can turn the needle for these three, essentially, this is the large value of import bill. I think we'll be able to manage it. These three would constitute, I think, about 33% of our total bill.
Okay. Rakesh, where do you see the trade relationship panning forward from here?
I think we need to obviously for public consumption here and in China for the domestic constituency, the political constituency with elections coming and heat on the current government in India that it has ceded space to China. In that context, I think the political relationship, the border dispute would obviously take center stage. But post the election fever, I think we must start rebuilding publicly. Privately, the government can still work on building the economic blocks without losing sight of the national interest when it comes to the security matters. And as I said, I'm a strong votary of looking at China, in two diametrically opposite directions. For the political issue, take them head on, which we have done, and intensify that peace. But when it comes to economics, the whole world wants us to look at each other and be more proactive.
Okay, interesting take coming in there. Look in diametrically opposite directions when it comes to politics and policy issues. Srinath, your take.
So I think until we achieve self-sufficiency in most of these matters, it is fine to absolutely collaborate with China. Look at the example of the US or the UK. They might have hated Russia. They still buy oil through different sources from them. So that is simple because of their domestic pressures, right? They will have to keep the engines running domestically. And that's something a learning for us. Until we achieve self-sufficiency in most of these, how do we work with China? How do we resolve nationalism very differently from economic affairs? I think politically, as Rakesh says, nationalism as a jingoism will work, but economics matters because we have to survive every single day.
Okay, Rakesh, Srinath, thanks very much, gentlemen, for joining us on that very important story. We will, of course, keep tracking developments with respect to trade deficit with China and the overall economic scenario there.